Adding authentication to your applications can be really tricky, but in this video, we're going to make it really, really simple. We're going to do serverless authentication with Next.js, Fauna and Auth0, and only write a few lines of code to do it. So let's go ahead and dive in. What's up, everyone? My name is James Q Quick, and I do weekly videos on web development related topics. So if you're looking for web dev, you're in the right spot. Now, one of the things that I love is building serverless applications in the Jamstack. That's been one of my passions for the last couple of years. So that's what we're going to look at in this video, is how to do authentication using Next.js, Fauna, and Auth0. So let's talk for a minute about how these things are going to fit together. The cool thing about Fauna, which we're going to use as our data store, database in this case, is that Fauna has some authentication and authorization rules inside of it, or in the platform. And so what we can do is kind of configure a custom identity provider inside of Fauna and then be able to offload all of our authentication to Auth0. Now, another thing we get to do inside of Fauna, though, after the user is authenticated, is define rules for what that user can do. So we can do all authentication and authorization in one without really writing any code, which is pretty neat. So what will happen is we'll have a user login through Auth0 that will return back an access token that we will send with each request to Fauna to get data. Fauna then will be able to parse that JWT, that access token, that JSON web token, look at the information inside, make sure it's valid, and then give a user a role based on that token, and that role will have different permissions that user can do. So that's a little bit about what we're going to cover. I say we just dive in because it's going to be a little easier to talk about it as we go along. So let's go ahead and get into it. All right, so I am logged into Fauna. What we're going to do is start by creating a new database. Now, everything I'm doing here is on a free tier, so just make sure that you know that you're not having to spend any money for this. All right, so let's go ahead and create this database. Let's just call this our test DB, and let's pre-populate this with demo data so we have some stuff to work with as we get started. So let's go ahead and create this, and you'll see it create several different collections as well as indexes or indices, basically that we can use for queries. So we can query all customers, orders, products, stores, and then you can do a couple of different ones that match up different properties. We don't really care too specifically about that. I'll let you dive into that more. But one of the things I do want to look at is in the security section, I want to look at roles. And there's two roles that are defined here, a customer and a manager. And so if we look at the settings for the customer, you can see that it has read access to the stores and the products collections, but not the orders and customers. Now, this is really cool because this means that based on those roles, we can define our authorization rules, who can read and delete and create what, based on this GUI here. So it's pretty easy to just add a checkbox to add different permissions here for different aspects of our collections that we're using. So I'm going to leave this the same. Just know that this customer role has access to read the store's information and the product's information. So let's go back really quickly and look at let's just look at products, for example. So here's some example products. You can see the dummy data in here. It's just data for us to start working with. So that's the kind of stuff that we want to be able to read inside of here. So what we want to do is configure Fauna to be able to work with an external identity provider in Auth0. So if we go to providers, we can add a new access provider. And this is going to say, hey, on the free tier, which is what I'm on, you have access to this feature. But if you move to the individual plan, you will not. So you'd have to go to an even bigger plan after that to get access to this. But it's all available in the free tier, so we should be good. So let's define this new access provider. And we want to know who the issuer is. And I'm going to go ahead and copy this in. So the issuer is going to be what domain is going to be creating the access tokens, the JSON web tokens that we're going to send along to Fauna. Now, I already have this kind of pre-populated here, but let me show you where you can find it. Inside of Auth0, again, sign up for a free account if you haven't already. You can create applications, and those applications get grouped under a specific tenant. And so your tenant, the James Q Quick -demos-2, is what I'm using as, let's see here, as the issuer inside of my access provider in Fauna. So if you look, there's James Q Quick -demos-2, and then it's .us.auth0.com because mine is based in the US. So you should be good to use your tenant name here just like that. Now, the next URL, this is the JSON web key secret URI. This may seem a little confusing and intimidating. Basically what this is, it's an endpoint for my tenant, again, James Q Quick -demos-2, that defines what the public keys are that can be used to validate the tokens as they get sent over. You don't need to fully understand all that stuff. You just need to have this URL come in here correctly. So it's the same as above, except we add on the .wellknown/jwks.json. If you want to look at this more, you can search some of the Auth0 documentation, but this is a standard URL and a standard that you can look a little bit more into with the JSON web key sets if you want to. All right. So inside of Fauna, we are defining this. Let's say this is going to be our Auth0 provider, and we filled out those two roles, and then we're going to choose a role. So what this means is if someone logs in with Auth0, passes that access token along to Fauna, they're going to get a specific role in Fauna. And remember, I showed you a couple of these roles to show you what access they have. So this customer role has access to read from the stores and the products collections, I believe. So it's automatically going to happen. All right, let's go ahead and save this. The one thing we want to copy is this audience up here. So I'm going to copy that and save this. And I think we need under name, I think it's no spaces. Let's try to save again. Cool. So that seemed to work. All right, so we have our provider configured on Fauna side, which means it's ready to receive these access tokens from Auth0, but we don't have anything set up in Auth0 to facilitate that. So let's go back to Auth0. I'm going to create a new application. When we do Next.js, these are considered regular web apps. So I'm going to call this my Fauna test app. It's a regular web app. And then we'll go ahead and create. And you'll see in the settings here, there's a couple of things that make this unique. There's the domain, which again is the tenant up here with .us.auth0.com. Then we've got a client ID and a client secret, and we'll use all of these in a second. And we're just going to use kind of the quick start project in here. So there is a Next.js quick start project. What we can do is download the sample, and I'll update these settings in a second. But we will download the sample. This will give us basically all the starter code we need to get started. So let me open this up in VS Code. All right, so I've got this project open in VS Code here, and it filled out a .env.local file, an environment variable file. And you'll see this has an Auth0 secret. This is just a random string, so you can kind of have that be whatever for now. A base URL, which in this case is the URL, the port that we're going to run this application at locally. The issuer base URL, which if you look at this is our tenant name, again, with .us.auth0.com. The client ID and the client secret, those are both in those settings inside of the application. I'll show you those in a second. And then we'll talk about Auth0 audience here in a second. So let's grab these properties. There's the callback URLs and the logout URLs. And what this is when you do authentication in Auth0 by default, what it does is redirect the user to Auth0, then it redirects them back. So we have to tell Auth0 where to send the user back to when that happens. Same thing with logout. So after login happens, where do we send them back here? After logout happens, where do we send them back here? All right, so I'm going to copy this. Let's close this. And let's go into the settings. Scroll down. Remember, this is where our domain, client ID, and client secret are. Keep scrolling down, and we have our callback URLs, which in this case will be this one. And then logout URLs would just be the localhost 3000. The quick start information for this, we'll have it if you walk through the documentation, you can get a little bit more info about it. But those are the settings that we need to add. So we'll go ahead and save that. Now, this creates the Auth0 application for us, but we're missing one thing that allows us to be able to talk to Fauna. To get the access tokens when a user logs in with Auth0, we have to define an audience. That's what this audience property is. That means who are we wanting to send these access tokens to? So what we can do is, if you remember back in Fauna, I copied this before. I copied the audience property out of Fauna. This is going to be the audience property in our application as well. So we'll paste that one in. And the last thing we need to do in Auth0 is define that as an API in Auth0. So if we go to APIs and we create a Fauna API, The identifier there is that audience, and then we click create. And that's kind of all we need to do. So what's going to happen is we'll log in with Auth0. Because we pass it this audience property, it's going to look for an API in Auth0 with that same identifier. It's going to create that access token that we can then send along to Fauna in our request. We'll see that in a second. So let's run two things in here. Let's run the npm install to get all of these packages up and going. And then I want to show you, let's zoom in a bit for you. Inside of the pages, API, and auth, there's this ... auth0 JS. Now this is, I think, really cool. This library for Next.js and Auth0, this is basically all you have to do to configure Auth0. And what this does is it creates routes to handle login, log out, the callback. I think mainly those, there may be a fourth one. A profile route or a me route. So it creates all those routes for you by default or just auto magically, which is really, really neat. So that's basically all the setup that we have to go through to get Auth0 working in this application. So now that these packages have finished running, we can do an npm run dev, and let's get this project up and running. And it looks like that port is already running, so I just killed it. So let's try that one more time, npm run dev. All right, that is running there. So let's go to localhost 3000 and see if we can see this application. All right, so that started up, which is good. Unfortunately, I'm already logged in, which is not good. Let me log out so I can show you this process from scratch. All right, so let's go ahead and log in. If you haven't already done this before, you might need to sign up here to create a user. I've already got a user, so I can go ahead and log in with that one. All right, and then this should redirect us back to the application after we granted access to grab profile information. It should redirect us back to the application where we can see that the user is logged in and we can view profile information about the users if we go here. So that works really well. Adding authentication just with Auth0 and the starter application is relatively easy. The only thing we needed was these different properties in here, as well as this dynamic route here for the ... Auth0 for the configuration. All right, so what is our next step? Well, our next step now is to test an external API. And what I mean here is we want to be able to query information from Fauna and pass along this access token that we get back from Auth0 and prove that we're able to access that information based on the access token that we pass. So let's go and look at one of these routes inside of API. I think it shows here. I'm going to copy this whole thing and I'm going to create a new file called stores.js and I'm going to paste this in. So let's take a look really quickly at what we're doing here. This is an API endpoint inside of Next.js. There's a few different hooks that come from the Auth0 package, the get access token and with API auth required. So by wrapping this function with API required, it makes sure that the user is logged in if they try to access this endpoint. And then we call get access token here to get the access token and attach it to the request that we send to Fauna. And we don't need to get that extra scope. Yeah, let's go ahead and get rid of all of this stuff. So we'll get the access token and then we'll get some data and then we'll return that data. Now, what we want to do is be able to call and interact with Fauna and query Fauna. So we need to install the actual Fauna package here to be able to work with it. So let's do an npm install of, not of, I say of, and then I spell it out. Npm install fauna db. So we'll install that package. And then from Fauna, we want to import the query as Q. So just a little shortener there to import the thing that's called query and then alias it as the letter Q. And then we'll also import the client from Fauna DB. All right, so we'll get that. And then we want to create the actual client itself. So we'll say client equals new client. And then what you do is you pass this configuration object and you pass it a secret. Now you could get a secret key from Fauna itself and then put that directly in here. What we're going to do instead is use that access token. So we're going to use that access token that comes from the user to create the Fauna client. which means when we make requests to Fauna, it's going to pass along that token. And remember, Fauna is already pre-configured or configured to accept that token and then grant access based on it. So now we need to do a basic Fauna query here, and I'm just going to paste. Let me paste this one in. All right, so what we have here is we are using our client and we're making a query. And then what we want to do is we want to map over each one of the objects that we get back and then get its reference or get the actual data associated with that reference. So we're going to paginate over all the documents in the collection of stores. Remember, we have that stores collection. And then what do we want to do with each one? We want to get the actual data from that reference. So from that reference, we want to get the actual data for that. So you can look at the Fauna SDK documentation or just Fauna in general documentation to kind of figure out how that works. And then what we'll do here is return back this data. And then we can log this out so we can see it as well. All right, so let's get this up and running. And I'm going to make the terminal bigger here so we can see this as we make these requests. So let us refresh this. Oh, the one other thing we need to do is the external API page. External API page is making requests to /API/shows, but we want to make it /API/stores. That's what we just updated ours to be. And then we want to make sure that the stores is not inside of the auth folder, so it's just inside of API. So this is how API routes work in Next.js, is it's /API, and then the file name inside of that shows or stores, in this case, is going to be the endpoint. So we want this external page to make a request to stores. All right, so hopefully that looks good. Let's go ahead and refresh this. I'm already logged in, which means I should have the access token. We can ping the API. All right, and it looks like I forgot to copy in one other thing where we destructure paginate documents collection lambda get and var from this query, this letter Q here. And then we're using them down here. Let's give this a save. And let's refresh on this page. Or actually, we could just ping the API here. It says unauthorized. Now, the one thing I often make this mistake is inside of Auth0, it's defining the issuer to be a slash on the end. So it's going to have a slash on the end of this URL. So we have to make sure that it matches up here. I'll show you why in a second as we make this request. Now, one additional thing I've done is log out this access token, and I'll show you that here in a second. So let's come back to the application. Let's do another ping, and hopefully now we're able to get back data. So this is all the data that was listed in that collection. Now, how did this work? Well, let's show, and we logged it out here too. Let's show this is the access token. Let me copy this. And an easy way that you can decode and see the information inside of a JWT, a JSON Web Token, is to go to JWT.io and just paste it in. And then it shows you all the information inside of this. Now, I won't get into details about how this stuff works, but just know that even though you can read this information, you can't fake creating it. You can't change this information. Fauna will be able to know if this thing has been tampered with. So if we look at the issuer here, it defines the issuer with a slash on the end. So that's why we had to update the issuer inside of the Fauna connection to have that trailing slash. And then you can also see the audience here. So the audience is basically who is this key intended for? And we gave it the identifier from Fauna or the audience. So let's look at this again. That is the db.fauna.com/db and then slash, basically a unique identifier for our database itself. So then what else do we have in here? We have an issued at expiration time. Expiration is in the future, so that's okay. And then it looks like everything is pretty good. So that's why we're able to access this information. Now, just to show you what would happen if we didn't do this, what if we didn't pass in the access token? What if we just did empty quotes here instead of the actual access token? Well, this would now come back as unauthorized, as you would probably expect. So we're proving that the access token is needed. But then also, what would happen if we added the access token? But what if we change the permissions in Fauna of that rule? So let's go back to security. Let's go to roles. Let's go to the customer role. And that's the one that gets assigned to someone who authenticates with Auth0. And let's remove the read from stores. Let's save this and let's come back to our application and let's ping the API again. And notice now that we get no data coming back. Now it's kind of interesting here. It gives you no data instead of unauthorized. And that may be intentional to not be too specific about who has access to what, but just proved here that we do have access based on the roles that are defined. So let's put this back to read and let's come down and save this one more time, come back to our application. Let's ping the API and get data back. So I think this is pretty neat. You can basically do all of your authentication and authorization rules without really writing any code for it. The Auth0 SDK kind of sets itself up for you. You grab that access token, you pass it along in your request to Fauna. Fauna is configured to know how to interpret and validate that access token based on the identity provider that we configured. And then based on those rules, we define our authorization. Based on this role, what do people have access to do? Can they read, write, update, delete from specific collections? So this is one of the neatest ways I found to do authentication. I think it's pretty cool in a serverless way with some cool technologies like Next.js, Auth0, and Fauna. Let me know what you thought about the video in the comments below. If you have any questions about security or which products to use or how they work together, let me know that in the comments as well. Thanks for checking out the video, and I'll catch you in the next one.